Hi, this is the June 17th JupyterLab meeting. Jason, you want to kick it off?
Sure. So as a short announcement to everybody, last night we had a short tutorial walkthrough of the Jupyter architecture, at least high-level parts of some of the architecture. And Jamie recorded that, and it's available. So you can watch that. And we also put the content in a new subdirectory of the JupyterLab repo, the /tutorial subdirectory. Eventually, I think that'll get moved. Steve mentioned moving it under docs and redoing how our docs are structured. But for now, it's under the /tutorial root directory in the JupyterLab repo. Okay.
Hey, Jamie, could you paste the URL into the hackpad?
For the video? Yeah, I think that's done already.
Yeah, and we should add a README to the /tutorial as well. Okay, let's just do quick status updates, and I have a question.
Hold on, though.
Oh, Brian?
I was meaning the JupyterLab walkthrough video in the she's on the phone.
Yep. It's in the JupyterLab architecture hackpad, so we'll just copy and paste it from there.
Ah, great. Yeah, if you can do that, and then I'll.
Sorry. I thought it might be Fernando. It was a 510 number, and I'm in LA, so it wasn't.
Okay, how about quick status updates? And I have a design question. Brian, I assume you have questions.
Yeah.
Steve, you want to go first? And then Darian?
All right. We're working on refactor, cleanup, and test suites for the pieces of the notebook model and widgets. And also the documentation in preparation for yesterday's tutorial. And I'll be continuing to write the test and do the cleanup as I'm going. And that's about it for me.
Darian?
Okay, so we've been refactoring the cells to use a pattern that accepts an options interface that has in it the functions that will generate the widgets that go inside a cell, because that way, well, it gives you a few things. One of the things that it gives you is that you won't always need to subclass a cell widget, that you might be able to get away with just simply passing in different options if you want a different kind of cell, and it lowers the barrier for customization. The other is that some of the phosphor widgets are doing the same thing, and we want to have a consistent pattern. And one of the things that was a little less clear was instantiating with a model or adding the model attribute after instantiation. We're still sorting that out, but we want to be able to change the model. Up until this point, cell models have not been able to be changed because they were private and you only pass them in upon instantiation. But if we allow you to change it, it means that we can keep things in the DOM and replace what's inside as an optimization. There can be scenarios where you won't want to, say, throw out a whole notebook. You might not want to re-instantiate the whole thing if you have the notebook on the screen and say you want to switch kernels, but it was a mostly empty notebook. It'll still be faster and more efficient to just switch models. And so if we can, from everything from the notebook down to its constituent parts, allow you to change models, then you can keep things in the DOM and only really swap things out in memory. And so one side effect of that has been that we won't be able to both pass in the model at instantiation and also make it swappable, because the only way to do that involves doing an async operation, but it's difficult to reason about that. So we're probably going to remove the ability to change, to pass in the model upon instantiation and only allow you to set it as an attribute after you instantiate it. And I think Chris did some research into this, and it turns out that Qt has a similar way of instantiating its widgets where you give a model after you instantiate it. So yeah, that's the rationale behind it. It's just we need to tweak the pattern and make sure we get it right so that it doesn't become one of these patterns that's easy to get wrong and trip people up.
So this reminds me, I mean, we're moving closer and closer to a React-ish type of workflow where the data is supreme. That's not a bad thing, I think. How are we handling different cell types? I mean, clearly, if we're trying to do optimizations where we're keeping things in the DOM, we're moving closer to like a virtual rendering type of thing where it would be easier to take care of that sort of optimization layer at a lower level than what the programmer is interacting at. But you know, the models can be different types.
Yeah, so this actually, almost all of the complexity is handled in the base cell widget, because all the base cell widget has to do is have a getter and a setter for the model, and then invoke a protected on-model change function that all of the other, all of the subclasses of the base cell widget might have custom functionality inside of, but they don't each write their own model getter and setter. All they really need to do is to have, just like they already have on update requests, they'll also have on model changed, and they could do whatever they need to do to initialize once a new model comes in. And if they themselves have children, so for example, the code cell widget might then say, okay, what I want to do is take this model's output and swap it for the outputs that my output area had before. So each of them really needs to do a very small task. The core functionality of switching models is taken care of in base cell widget.
But I think it's important, though, to establish what the use case is for this. Oops.
You're good. We hear you.
Because I don't, Jason, I don't think we're wanting to move to an architecture where anytime a model changes, we just reset the model attribute. Like that doesn't, I think that goes against everything we've started to build so far.
Right, we're not suggesting that. This is more of you've got a notebook widget on the page, and you'd like to switch it out to a completely different model, different file even, but you're going to reuse as many of those subcomponents as you can in that process. And the other sorry, go ahead.
You could even imagine that you're swapping out non-real-time models for real-time models.
Right. And the other technical reason for moving the model out of the constructor is that basically every method in JavaScript is a virtual method, and you shouldn't be calling virtual methods from your constructor. So, for example, anything that you wanted to do on the creation of a model, if that was overridden by a subclass, then that subclass would not be fully initialized when you're calling that function. So anything that would have been in that subclass's constructor would not have been called yet. So you have uninitialized state. So that's a technical reason to do what we're doing as well.
Well, I mean, those are two issues, I think. One is whether we want the model to be replaceable. But once you have the model replaceable, then you'll have a bunch of state that you need to rebuild whenever the model's replaced. And then you can't do that synchronously in the constructor, which is, I think, what he's doing with the post message. He's doing it asynchronously in the constructor. But those are two separate issues, right?
Right.
Whether we want the model to be replaced,
that's correct. That's
and then
why,
how to replace the model.
The problem with doing it asynchronously is that you then have to, as the person writing the code, you have to realize that I have to wait for an animation frame in order for this to actually take place, versus just assuming it's taking place synchronously.
Yeah, that's nasty.
Agreed.
So, Yeah, back up even one more. So again, what's the use case for being able to replace the model? If we're swapping out an entire notebook model, as like using the same notebook widget for a different file, it seems much simpler to just scrap the notebook widget and pull up a new notebook widget if it really is representing a different file.
Well, it is much simpler to do it that way, but it's only simpler for us when we're speaking about it. The reality is that each of these models being swapped only has to do a minimal amount of work, so it might actually be super simple on each individual class to just say, if your model changed, here's what you should do. And many classes, what they'll have to do is just throw out a bunch of their children anyway. So it'll end up doing the least amount of work in the DOM that it needs to do for very little cost. It's a lot like the virtual DOM you're thinking of, but it'll be really sort of cheap to build it, and we gain a lot without having to do much extra thought, because all we're really doing is taking some code that we already had in our constructor and we're just moving it to a different function called onModelChanged. The change in lines of code is virtually nil, but the benefit that we get is actually fairly substantial. And it's not actually much more difficult to think about it, because all you're saying is, oh, as soon as you get a model, do this with it. And in fact, if you want, currently you can just throw everything away and it'll be as though you reinstantiated, or you can do something more subtle depending on what the capabilities of your children are. So right now, the output area didn't support switching outputs. So what I was doing was just throwing it out and creating a new one, because that's what I had available. But now with this new PR that Steve's put in, we can change that to a more subtle behavior. But it's not particularly difficult to reason about once the pattern is established.
Yeah, I mean,
What's the use case for are you going to keep a cache of notebook widgets and then just reuse them as you need them? And what's the use case for swapping out an entire notebook model? You have a notebook widget on a page. It's
switching the kernel. If you've got a notebook open and you switch its kernel, you can imagine that all that operation really is switching its model. Same with the console. I'm not sure.
The kernel wouldn't do that. The kernel is totally separate from the model. That would be a completely separate thing from the model content.
Right. This use case that you're talking about, Jason, is not would not be part of the document widget workflow. This would be if someone wanted to use this class in a different way, where they're keeping this cache and swapping out things. If you had like, a notebook preview widget that wasn't part of for some reason it wasn't even in JupyterLab. It's just a notebook preview widget, and you want to be able to swap out the file contents. You just keep that widget on the page and swap out its model.
Yeah.
So this isn't necessarily a JupyterLab application, but it's something that could be done with this class for a minimal extra effort. And right now, actually, on the notebook, I just put a to-do. Maybe you might want to optimize the cells, but right now it just clears them. So it doesn't reuse the underlying cells, but that could later be added to support these type of use cases.
I mean, I can imagine
if we should just go all the way. I mean, we're going halfway to a React-ish type solution where a lot of the optimization is taken care of for us. Taking a DOM structure and replacing the content of it, and then intelligently re-rendering what's in the DOM. I mean, that's exactly the value add from React.
But I don't think we're designing this to be used anytime state changes. I think we're saying, like, this would be a like a different file, or like there's some deep semantic meaning to this. It's not just rendering optimization. I could imagine us using this when a user clears output. We just replace all the output models by new empty output models. But I don't know. I view that as very different from every time any model changes to resetting the models. And I don't think we should do that. And I don't think we should start to use this capability in that way. I think
I mean, so again, React took it to the extreme where they say every time anything changes, we're giving you a completely new model, but you have fast ways of determining what changed and what didn't change in your model, whereas we're doing that bookkeeping by hand. And I'm not saying that, like, for output areas where you have a cell that's constantly having output that's changing, you know, the optimization of keeping the DOM there and reusing the DOM elements that are there. It feels like we're introducing a lot of complexity, relatively, to the current thinking of there's a model and it's static or it's not static, but it's permanent, it's final. You know, it's what the widget represents. And maybe the point is to support use cases that are out there that we haven't considered yet, but then you could say, well, if we're going to go halfway to the solution of trying to reuse widgets and stuff like that, I mean, maybe the people that would want to do that would really rather just go all the way and do something like React that does a lot of more automatic bookkeeping and optimization for these sorts of cases.
Yeah, I mean,
we currently have, except, sorry, I was just going to comment that what we currently have basically says instantiate with a model, and we expose the model as a public attribute that you can get, and if you try to set it, it throws an error. So really from an end user, not an end user, a developer point of view, all that's really changed is that they could both get and set that attribute. They don't have to really think about what else is very different. It's basically that when you see, you know, cell.model and it works, and then you try to set cell.model and it blows up, now it's not going to blow up anymore. I kind of think that actually it's often counterintuitive when you try to change an attribute and it throws an error. Now, if you try to change that attribute, it just works. That actually seems more intuitive for JavaScript developers from just your experience normally is that changing an attribute should work. And
we have tons of read-only attributes. Yeah, we have tons of read-only attributes. So
no,
I mean,
we absolutely do.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to have read-only attributes, but what I am suggesting is that there's no additional cognitive burden that this design imposes. It's not that it's more complex to think about, I don't think.
I'm not talking necessarily from the user's point of view, though from the user's point of view, it's nice that I can, once I have a reference to the model and a widget, I can keep that reference around. Now, I think that's a pattern we should probably discourage. So that's not an issue, but that was one nice thing you get with read-only.
Yeah.
But the other thing, I mean, we're already seeing the complexity it's introducing in our constructor, because once you can change the model, okay, now you might have side effects. Okay, well, we can't call those side effects from within the constructor, so we have to do it asynchronously or some other way. Or
well, there's always going to be side effects to setting the model, and that's why we had to pull it out of the constructor entirely.
Right, and so
you're going to have to you have to assign the model at some point, and to me that's probably why Qt made it as a separate two-step initialization, so that they could do the initialization of the object, and then when you add the model, everything's in a non-virtual state, and you can call your virtual methods.
Right. So now we're saying from the user perspective, you don't set the model in the constructor. You have to set it afterwards. So you can have a widget with a null model, and now you have to, and now all of your methods have to be aware that the model could be null and check for that and things like that. So I mean, there is a lot of extra complexity on the developer side, not necessarily on the user side.
But I'm saying we have to take that period. We were faking our way out of it before, but it was a ticking time bomb. So we've acknowledged that you can't do it in the constructor. It's just a matter of how do we handle that fact. We can make the model write once, like we have the layout in the Phosphor widget is write once, and then you can't change it again. It enforces that, and that would throw out the whole the idea that we're moving toward React in some way. And I'm fine with that. It was just if we could make an optimization, we were going to do it. But if it's going to bring up all these other questions, I say don't even do it. Just it's a static thing. You can set it once.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is really important is that where the React model tends to assume that the models are immutable, or it's optimized for that case. And I think
for the optimization, yeah.
I'm a little worried. I mean, obviously our models are designed to be mutable, and I'm a little worried that we'll run into weird situations where someone will have a model and start mutating state on it, and then someone else will replace the model, and all of a sudden the model that they're mutating is not the model that's hooked up to the view.
We're assuming yeah. I mean, one way to, yeah.
And so I'm worried about the problems that come along with references to the mutable state and being able to swap it out.
Okay, so
I'm fine with us initializing the model after the constructor. I think from an API perspective, that cleans it up a lot. I'm nervous about us sort of always allowing them to be replaced that I'm not sure that makes sense. That may cause more problems than we want.
Okay, we can make it so that you only set it once. That's totally fine. And then if we find a use case that's more compelling than the ones we've come up with so far, we can then make it settable. That will be an API change that won't affect anyone because it'll be backward compatible. So that's totally fine. But we do need to take it out of the constructor. That was how we got here to begin with.
But wait. What's the argument against having it be an argument to the constructor and you simply set the property this._model, maybe with a getter, or, this.model as that? That's not going to trigger any problems.
Because the widget would not be initialized then based on the state of the model that's passed to it. That would be fine if the model were guaranteed to be uninitialized when you handed it to the widget and then you initialize it. But if you hand an initialized model to the widget, then the widget needs to respond to the state of the model.
Yeah.
And you can't do that in the constructor.
No, but this is, okay, so this is a constructor. The constructor is simply just setting the model attribute. That's it.
But you then need to call a separate method that says like activate or respond to the model or something.
Right, and my first attempt to do that was based on attach. I checked to see if I had an initialized flag set, and I went and basically accounted for the fact that I had a model set, and that was only done once. However, what that means is the widget is completely uninitialized until the first time it's attached. So again, you have this problem of you have to wait for some state asynchronously to happen until you can actually interact with that widget because it's in an uninitialized state.
Right.
So the only way to have synchronous code that works exactly the way it looks like it's going to work is to have a constructor that doesn't take a model and then set a model attribute, and then everything can happen synchronously. You don't have to ever do any checking for initialization or do the weird post message that needs to happen now or anything like that. That's the only way to guarantee it.
I agree that you have to have a two-stage initialization if you're going to act on setting up the widget based on the model attributes. I mean, you could have the constructor take the model and then a separate .init widget or something like that.
Yes.
But you're saying the init widget should take the model and you shouldn't set the model to constructor. That's what I'm hearing you saying.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Can you say it again, please?
Well, it's the same. We already have a getter for the model. So set model as a property versus initialized widget handing in a model is the same thing. Just a matter, I guess, which.
But I think Jason is saying we could keep the model being passed in the constructor and then have a no argument initialize widget method that you have to call after that triggers the events based on the model that was set in the constructor.
Yeah, and that's a fair thing to do. It's just an additional burden on the user to make sure they call that. But if it's part of the API and they have to do that, then they have to do that. It's just two-step initialization one way or the other.
I probably I think both are doable. I probably prefer.
The nice thing about the constructor is it enforces the only once, and it's not surprising to the user because they know the constructor is only called once.
Yep. Yeah. My only worry about that though is that people will say, "Hey, I passed my model. Why isn't it responding?" Whereas if we do it not in the constructor, it's very clear to them that, well,
The model's not set,
because you didn't pass the model.
and then they say,
And
"Why can't I just pass the model?"
have, just to be nice, we could even put in the on after attach. We could say, look, if model is null, throw an error. Then you're trying to attach a widget where model is null. That way, they'll never accidentally try to instantiate a widget that they haven't attached the model to.
And then I think the other thing is when the model getter throw an error when the model's null. So that way you don't have to keep checking this dot model in every one of your instance methods to check to see if this dot model is null.
Well, the model is nulled out when you dispose of the widget, so that test wouldn't.
But so actually, here's a question. We would do this on all of our classes where we have a model view architecture. I'm assuming. I mean, it's the same thing for any model view architecture.
Yeah.
Are there use cases outside of like the notebook widget? Like, we should do the same pattern everywhere in JupyterLab, even outside of the notebook plugin where there's a model view architecture. Pattern. Yeah. Is there a reason to prefer one solution over the other for more general use cases in JupyterLab?
Or you could have both solutions like layouts right now in Phosphor, where you can pass it into the constructor, or you can set it separately, but you can only set it once. And if you set it in the constructor, you can't have set layout. At least I think that's how Phosphor used to work. I don't know if it works like that.
Right, that's true. And we're relying on the fact that you haven't. We're taking the hit of the fact that you might be in an initialized state as a subclass, but and there are some cases where we have to set the layout in the constructor. It's just part of the fundamental action of that thing.
Like the box panel, you set the box layout in the constructor because that's what a box panel is.
Right. So you're hoping that if you add extra logic on layout change, that it's not relying on state that needed to be set in its own constructor in that subclass.
This is exactly the fire that we're trying to prevent.
Right. But in this case, we're pretty sure something is going to happen in the subclass when you set a model. So we cannot set it in the constructor.
Yeah. Too bad we don't have the Python type two-stage initialization where the constructor is separate from the initialization. We could do a two-stage construction phase and initialization phase, and that's just our API. You construct, and that's where we could pattern it after the Python, where the attributes are set up in the constructor, and then the initialization is what everybody should override. The Backbone has this too, actually, where the constructor you don't override, you just override the initialize method.
I think it's a more natural thing, instead of calling an init function on an object you just created, to just say dot model equals something. I think that is, nobody looking at an example will be confused, and nobody looking at an example will wonder, okay, which things have dot in it and which things don't, and when do I need to do that? Instead, it'll just be, why? Okay, I guess what I have to do is attach a model to this.
Yeah. I mean, I think I probably agree with that no one, like, if you think about teaching this, people would say, oh, well, of course, you're setting your model. Whereas if we have an init call, I think all of a sudden they'd be, well, why do we have to call init? There's already a constructor. The constructor is taking the arguments. That's stupid. Just call init automatically in the constructor. And then we have,
But then
have to tell them.
How come I can't set the model twice? I mean, that's the complication you face, right?
Well, but we can, if that turns out to be a usage case and we find, wow, people want to set the model twice in certain cases, well, we don't have to break API to all of a sudden allow that. But I think we could start conservatively. So that, I think that's probably.
So the other argument, again, I'm bringing up a lot of things sort of as devil's advocate here. The other argument would be, are there any other attributes besides model? I mean,
I was just about to ask that.
If there's a lot of attributes, then it may make sense to set them all up in the constructor and then have a single init function that you override, and that's where you take care of all your cross initialization.
Well, I would argue that the view is mirroring the model, so that everything that would affect it should be in that model. So that should be the only thing you have.
But
your initialization options are things like renderers. So you can actually, for a base cell widget, you could initialize and not send anything in. It defaults to everything you need. For the markdown, actually, yeah, for all of them, they'll default to a renderer. So you can initialize without passing anything in, and they do have other attributes. Those attributes are not consequential in the way model is.
It's true. There are widget options like the renderer.
But yeah, the only really consequential one, at least in the cells, is model. All the other attributes are fine. You can set them. You could read them whenever you like. You don't have to worry about initialization. And I think the point about being able in the future to change our minds and decide that these will not be read-only, I think leaving that door open is good, and having that pattern of just setting the attribute means that if at some point anybody actually wants it, first off, we'll have a good rationale, we'll have a good story behind why we're now enabling it, and secondly, it'll be backward compatible and nobody will be surprised.
Yeah, a complication that could come up is if we end up having multiple attributes that need initialization, initializing them in the right order. Maybe this isn't the case right now, and I agree with Steve.
I would say that we would cross that bridge when we get there. If you have more than one thing to initialize, then that becomes an initialized method, and you pass the things to the options to initialize. So,
I would argue if you have more than one thing that needs to be initialized, it's probably that both, or however many of those things there are, they all belong in your model. You don't normally pass multiple volatile things in like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
In this case where we have models of views. Yeah.
So the other issue is that obviously a lot of widgets don't have models, and I'm a little, if we had a separate initialization method, I'm a little worried about the fact that some widgets would have that and some widgets won't. I think that would be confusing, whereas it's a little more clear to me that some widgets have models and some widgets don't. And so I like that, the API around this focusing on the models rather than some mysterious init method that needs to be called. But I should say I'm in favor of this change, though not because of the usage cases, like being able to actually replace models and all that, but more than it's working around some of the complexities of the constructor and virtual methods and it all being asynchronous. Like more technical reasons rather than usage case reasons. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any other objections, any other regrets we might have in moving to. So, I mean, what's the proposal on the table is then to make the model setter automatically invoke initialization, and the users, it's up to the user to construct the object and then set the model.
Yep.
Right, and it's set once.
And it's set once.
Read only after that.
And how are we dealing with a null model internally, like in the methods of the class?
Yeah, we have to check to see that the model is null or not before we do anything. Make sure we're doing that internally.
I think that's terrible. That's terrible if we have to do that in every method. But if we could do it in the getter,
can we?
If we can do it in the getter and throw an error.
Well, you're going to get an error when you try to use it anyway if it's null. So I don't think it belongs in the getter.
Yeah, I guess as soon as you do this, that model done. So
these aren't gigantic classes, though. These are pretty small, and the way they're actually currently written is that the things that need the model don't get called until the model's ready. And if we build it this way, where you have to set that attribute when there's an actual model, it's fine. It will remain the case that those functions don't get called until there is a model. So there's actually, we don't do any checking right now if the model exists, because onModelChanged only gets called when a model exists. And if we're talking about not allowing you to change it to null, then it's never going to be an issue.
Yeah.
But if if a user forgets to set the model, then attaches it to the document, etc., I mean, you're going to get these null errors.
No, they're not going to get called, because the method that actually uses the model is called onModelChanged, and it's only going to fire if the model has been changed to a non-null value. So you're still just never going to reference the model. We might want to, in the onAfterAttach method, we might want to, as a courtesy, have a thing that says if model is null, throw an error so the developer knows. But in general, there's no actual time that we need the model and we need to check. Like if you could look at that PR, even though it's not exactly what we're describing right now, it's close enough that you'll see there's no need to check if the model exists.
Yeah. I mean, it's true that, like, if you don't pass a model, one of these widgets is probably not going to do anything useful or reasonable on the screen. It's more a question of how do we notify the developer that they forgot to do that.
Right. That's why I'm suggesting in the AfterAttach method, you could just throw an error. You could do a console warn. You can do any number of things that nobody should push code once they see. So, like, if anyone wants to see their thing appear on the screen, they will see it throw an error if we put it in there.
Yeah. So the proposal is also then to take the model out of the constructor options. I think you have the model in the constructor options right now in some of your iterations.
Right. In Darian's PR, it's there, but in the other two, it's not. So yeah, we'll just update Darian's.
Yeah.
The other two?
There's open PRs against the notebook and the output area right now. So I'll update those based on this conversation as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this yesterday, what I was doing was the asynchronous way. And then when Steve and I talked this morning, it just became clear that we don't want to have anything asynchronously happening that appears to be synchronous, because that'll just confuse anyone trying to reason about it.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. You okay with this plan, Jason?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a bummer you have construction and initialization. That you have to have those two separate things that follow each other.
Let's write a new language.
Yeah, that's right. Let's rewrite everything in a new language. But first we have to write a compiler. Chris will be a good one to do this. Yeah, okay. That sounds good to me. And then just the user pattern that people will have to do is sort of this building pattern where you have to construct the object, then set the model. Yeah, but when you construct the object, they will be setting the render mode for output areas and for notebooks and things like that. I assume that's
Yes,
what
things
we're
that are static,
on the same page.
that it wouldn't trigger other actions, then yeah, those should be part of the constructor args.
Yeah, because really they're part of the constructing of the widget, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, they're just setting properties on the widget that are used later. Okay, yeah, sounds good to me. Okay, that was my big question that I wanted to have a discussion about. Is there anything else, Brian? Do you have, or Steve, or Darian?
No, that's it for me.
Just one question, a design pattern question. In some parts of the code base, I see there's this special private namespace that's a sort of like a private namespace bag of attributes. And I guess
Yeah,
my question,
that's right.
why don't we put those in? Like, the normal object-oriented model would be to just put private attributes inside the actual class, not a separate class.
Yeah, so those are not actually so those are standalone functions or things that could have been potentially static methods, but we don't want them to be publicly available. So you can't have one way we could have done it is to have simply made them be functions in that file, because then they would have been private to that file. So for example, we share, say, a signal instance among multiple instances, but we didn't want that to be a statically accessible variable. And we use some functions that, like, so the factories right now that create your various nodes, those are things that don't really require, we don't want to make them be private methods, because you only need one and they don't rely on being part of an instance or anything. So just as a housekeeping measure, instead of having the file littered with a bunch of top-level things, we have a smaller number of top-level things. And the things that truly are supposed to be static, we'll put in a namespace that has the same name as the class. And the things that truly are private, we'll put them in a namespace called private. That way, it's just that the file itself has a very small number of top-level things.
And you could also fold that code away, the whole private namespace, in your editor.
And when you're calling it, it's clear that this is a not exported function. I mean, you could just make it a not exported function at the top level, down at the bottom of your file. But having a private namespace makes it clear when you call it that this is not an exported function. This is something reserving. But are you implying, Darian, that you're moving away from static attributes on classes?
No, only the ones that we're using static, and that namespace will be called the name of the class, so it'll be shared. So if you see, like, there's class static notebook and namespace static notebook for static things associated with the notebook, but things that aren't supposed to be publicly seen are down in that private namespace.
So you can. I mean, what's the difference between using a private static function and the class namespace that's not exported?
The class namespace is exported. That's the convention. Conventionally, the class namespace is exported and the private one is not exported.
Right. So then what's the difference between using the class static methods or functions and the namespace functions? How come we're taking things out? How come we're putting things in a namespace that's the same name as the class and relying on or overriding of
Chris would have to answer that. It's more aesthetic, I believe. I mean, the end result is the same. It's still a static method or attribute on the class. It's more of my guess would be it's more of a bookkeeping thing where you're focusing on the instance methods, and then if you want to go look at the static, it's down below. But yeah, Chris will have to weigh in on that.
So my question is, are we implying that we're moving away from class static attributes?
Well, they are, and the namespace means that it's static. That's
right in the declaration. I mean, are we never going to?
In general, yes. I mean, things that were static methods
that the style change that's happening here.
Yes, things that were static methods even on existing phosphor classes are moving into constructor arguments that are threaded through, so that you don't have to subclass and override a static method. You can just customize by passing in different constructor args. And then we had already moved some things that were like interfaces down to this exported namespace. So it's still part of static notebook, the class, but options is down in the namespace because it's not really and actually goes away. It's more of a TypeScriptism. So those are the kind of things that we had down in the exported namespace. Were not methods, but interfaces.
Okay,
so
that's different.
It's more of a bookkeeping.
That's a TypeScriptism. Yeah. That's a TypeScriptism. Yeah. I don't even know if a class can have a static interface. When I say static interface, I mean declared static.
Oh
interface.
No. Yes, that is the reason for having it. So yes, it is to enable us to refer to the class dot interface something. So it's a TypeScriptism. Yep, you're right. That's the reason for doing it.
But we still will have declared static methods in a class when it makes sense.
Yeah, so like Phosphor widget, I think still has the create node as a static method, and it's not.
That's actually going away, Darren.
Except for.
Oh, is that going away? Okay.
Yeah, the next PR said is
static
going out.
Functions. Yes, factory static functions, you're moving to the constructor, but there might be other static functions, and you're saying style-wise, we're still keeping with the static functions when it makes sense, but not at static factories. And the static factories are moving into constructor arguments.
Right.
Okay, what about static default? Because so I noticed in the cell PR, I think the default this default factory was now down in this namespace instead of being a static default.
And that could have been just
it could be
like
a private. It could be a private static.
That default factory isn't private in the PR, isn't it?
No, the model, the pattern that I was copying from Chris was to make it not private, and the reason for that is you can use that object using object.create and actually just override one of the properties of it. And so it's supporting that use case, right? So you can subclass that object, use it as a prototype using object.create, and just override one of the three methods in it, for example. So that's what that use case is supporting.
Oh, so your so your factories are starting to become complete objects in themselves instead of just a function,
right? Exactly.
And then once it becomes an object of itself, you need it to be separate from like a method, a static method on the class. Okay.
Yeah, it's an object in the static namespace of the class that you can override the whole thing, or you could just make your own, or you can override one piece of that using object.create.
Right. Okay. Okay, can we capture these style changes somewhere? Either in the notes here or even better on an issue?
I did start doing that on the outputs PR. I listed some of the changes there, so I will beef that up with what we discussed today. And some of the rationale there, so it's captured somewhere.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it may make sense for us to document sort of architectural choices we're making like this, like the sort of, and part of it is when other developers come and start working on the code base, they will have to make the same choices, and it would be nice if we can record to them. Here's sort of the architectural code design questions
that we're using.
Right. Yeah, and that would complement a style guide. So that would be a an
Exactly.
architecture guide.
Exactly. And then what we can do is write TS-lint rules. I was reading more about TS-lint because of the constructors calling overridable methods, and I thought, oh, this should be totally in TS-lint. But
I could check in my TS-lint file to the repo if that's helpful.
Do you have a TS-lint file? Yeah,
Yeah,
that would
I'm
be
using
really
it right
helpful.
now.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't been using it, but I realized that they have one rule, for example, that enforces the order in which things are declared.
Right.
Which I'm not sure how they do from an AST.
Yeah.
But anyway.
We might not want to do that because a lot of times we want to keep semantic things next to each other, even if they're not alphabetical. I personally often alphabetize and then come back to it and look at what
I'm not talking about.
and it's off.
I'm not talking about alphabetical. I'm talking about public first, then private last. That sort of thing.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
We're also not saying that we enforce the TS-lint.
Yeah, right. Good idea. Yep. Okay, great. This conversation has been really helpful to me to understand some of the style changes that you were pulling over from Phosphor. That I guess you guys have had a lot of discussion on Phosphor, but we haven't been in those discussions.
Yeah.
I guess what we're saying is I will add an architecture.md file to the tutorial with some of these ideas.
Or maybe patterns.
Yeah, patterns would probably be better.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay,
all right.
Sounds good. Anything else?
We should probably call it there.
Yep.
Yeah, Brandon just changed our meeting with Fernando to 10:15.
Okay.
I did want to just share with you guys that I gave a talk yesterday. I'm in LA right now, and there was a half-day workshop put on by Data Science Inc. and then the West Big Data Innovation Hub, which is an NSF-funded initiative. So it was a 15-minute talk about Jupyter. And at the end, I had one slide on JupyterLab and brought in that the GIF from the JupyterLab repo that just kind of shows the windows, the tiles getting moved around to give people a flavor of what JupyterLab is. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but I thought I'd just share that with you in case some random person, somebody from the workshop reaches out to you and asks questions.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great.
I've actually got a meeting right now that I'm perpetually late for too, so I better go.
Okay. Bye, Jason.
Bye, everyone.